The great chamber of the Galactic Council buzzed with tension. Representatives from dozens of worlds sat in their floating seats, their voices rising as they argued about the coming war. The massive dome above them showed the stars, but today, those stars seemed darker than usual. Ambassador Huck sat quietly in the human section, watching the aliens debate. His dark eyes moved from speaker to speaker as each representative made their case. The humans had been part of this council for 50 years now, but moments like this still felt strange to him. The Zentari delegate stood up first, his four arms spread wide as he spoke in his booming voice. The raiders from the Outer Rim grow bolder each day. They attack our trade ships and steal our people. We cannot wait any longer. Murmurs of agreement filled the chamber. The Zentari were warriors, their red skin marked with battle scars that showed their honor. Their delegate continued. Craxus, our god of war, has blessed our weapons. He demands we strike back with full force. A ripple of excitement went through the assembled aliens. War gods were serious business in the galaxy. When a species called upon their divine patron of battle, it meant they were ready for total war. The Vorthak representative slithered forward on her snake-like body. Her voice hissed as she spoke. Bloodrender thirsts for combat. Our god grows restless with waiting. The time for diplomacy has passed, more voices joined in. The Solani commander, his metallic skin gleaming under the chamber lights, declared that Ironwill had already blessed their fleets. The hegemony's ambassador announced that Warbringer was preparing for the great battle to come. One by one, each species spoke of their war god. Some were ancient beings of pure rage and violence. Others were tactical geniuses who guided their followers to victory. A few were honor-bound deities who demanded fair combat. But all of them were real, powerful, and ready to lead their people into battle. The chamber grew quiet as all eyes turned to the human section. Hayek felt the weight of their stares. He had known this moment would come eventually. The Zentari delegate looked directly at him. Ambassador Hayek, what does humanity say? Which war god do your people call upon? The silence stretched on. Hayek could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Around the chamber, aliens leaned forward in their seats, waiting for his answer. Some looked curious. Others seemed excited to hear about humanity's divine patron. But a few looked nervous. Those were the ones who had fought against human forces before. They had seen what humans could do in battle, and they knew something was different about them. Yuck stood up slowly. His simple gray uniform looked plain next to the elaborate armor and robes of the other delegates. He cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire chamber. We don't have one anymore. The silence that followed was complete. Not a single being in the chamber made a sound. The words hung in the air like a physical thing. The Zentari delegate blinked all four of his eyes. What do you mean? Every warrior species has a god of war. How can you fight without divine guidance? Hayuk looked around the chamber. He saw confusion on every face. Some aliens whispered to each other in their native languages. Others simply stared at him as if he had spoken in riddles. I mean exactly what I said, Hayuk replied calmly. Humanity does not have a god of war. The Vorthak representative coiled her body tighter. But your species is known across the galaxy for your military strength. Your tactics are studied in war colleges on 100 worlds. How is this possible without a divine patron? A Solani observer called out from the gallery. The humans conquered the Kef Empire in 6 months. They broke the siege of Tarlax that had lasted for 3 years. No species fights like they do. More voices joined in. Stories of human military victories filled the air. The Battle of Seven Suns, where one human fleet defeated 3 enemy armadas. The defense of New Geneva, where human soldiers held off attackers for 40 days without rest. The Lightning Campaign that ended the border wars in just 2 weeks. Each tale was true. Hayuk had been present at some of those battles himself. He remembered the look of fear in enemy eyes when they realized they were fighting humans. The chamber erupted in confused chatter. The idea that the galaxy's most feared military force had no war, God, was impossible to accept. It went against everything they knew about how warfare worked. An elderly hegemony senator stood up. His voice carried the wisdom of centuries. Young human, perhaps you misunderstand the question. We do not ask about your current God. We ask about your war deity, the divine being who first taught your ancestors to fight. Hyuk met the old senator's gaze. I understand the question perfectly, and my answer remains the same. We don't have a god of war. The Zentari delegate's voice rose higher. Then how do you fight? How do you win? Every species needs divine blessing in battle. It is the natural order of things. Around the chamber, other delegates nodded. This was basic truth to them. War was too important to leave to mortals alone. Gods of war provided strategy, blessed weapons, and gave warriors the strength to face death. Without them, armies were just mobs of frightened beings with sharp sticks. Hyuk stood silent for a long moment. He could feel the weight of galactic history pressing down on him. These beings had fought wars for millions of years, always with their gods at their side. They could not imagine any other way. Finally, he spoke again. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. You want to know how we fight without a god of war? You want to know why we win? Every being in the chamber leaned forward. This was the mystery that had puzzled military scholars across the galaxy. How did humans achieve such impossible victories without divine help? Hyuk's expression grew serious. His eyes seemed to look past the assembled aliens, back through time itself. We don't have a god of war anymore because we killed him. The words hit the chamber like a physical blow. Several delegates gasped. Others made religious signs with their hands or appendages. The very idea of killing a god was beyond their understanding. Impossible, breathed the Vorthak representative. Gods cannot die. They are eternal. Hayuk looked at her directly. Tell that to Korith. The name meant nothing to the aliens, but the way Hayuk said it made them all shiver. There was something in his tone, something cold and final, that spoke of ancient crimes and terrible prices paid. The Zentari delegate found his voice first. What happened? Hayuk was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his words would change how every species in the galaxy looked at humanity forever. That, he said slowly, is a long story. Hayuk began his tale, and the chamber fell completely silent. Even the air recycling systems seemed to quiet down, as if the station itself wanted to hear this story. Long ago, when humans first learned to make fire and shape tools, we were weak. The world was full of creatures bigger and stronger than us. We had no claws, no thick hide, no poison. All we had were our minds and our hands. He paused, looking around the chamber at all the different species. Some were natural predators with sharp teeth and powerful muscles. Others had armor-like shells or deadly toxins. All of them had been born with weapons that humans lacked. In those early days, we died often. Predators hunted us. Disease killed our children. Other tribes took our food and our territory. We were nothing special, just another animal trying to survive. The alien delegates listened carefully. This was not how they had imagined humanity's origin story. Most species told tales of their ancestors being chosen by gods or blessed with great power from the beginning. But then Koreth came to us, Hayuk continued. He appeared to our tribe leaders in dreams and visions. At first they thought he was just another spirit of the hunt or the storm. But Koreth was different. Hayuk's voice took on a different tone as he described the god. Koreth was tall and strong, with eyes that held the wisdom of countless battles. He carried no weapon, but his presence alone could stop fights before they started. When he spoke, even the bravest warriors listened. In the chamber, several aliens shifted uncomfortably. They were remembering their own first meetings with their war gods ages ago when their species were young. Koreth did not demand blood sacrifices or endless conquest like other war spirits. Instead, he taught us something new. He showed us that the strongest warriors were not always the biggest or the meanest. He taught us that the mind was our greatest weapon. Hayuk began to pace as he spoke, his hands moving to illustrate his words. Under Koreth's guidance, a human named Tajin became the first great war leader of our people. Tajin was not large, but he was clever. When enemy tribes attacked with twice as many warriors, Tajin would lead them into traps. He would use the land itself as his weapon. The Solani delegate leaned forward. His people valued tactical thinking above raw strength. This Tajin sounds like a worthy commander. He was, Hayuk agreed. But more than that, he was honorable. Koreth taught him that victory meant nothing if it came at the cost of becoming a monster. When Tajin defeated his enemies, he offered them a choice: join his tribe or leave in peace, Ermers. Of surprise rippled through the chamber. This was not how most war gods operated. Usually defeat meant death or slavery. There was also Sora, Hayuk continued. She led the warriors who protected the weak and the injured. Koreth taught her that true strength was not about crushing those beneath you, but about lifting them up. Under her leadership, even the smallest and weakest members of the tribe became valuable. The Vorthak representative coiled tighter. Her people had always believed that weakness should be eliminated, not protected. This god of yours sounds more like a god of mercy than a god of war. Hayuk nodded slowly. Perhaps, but under Koreth's teaching, we grew strong in ways that pure violence never could have achieved. We learned to work together, to plan ahead, to turn our enemies' strength against them. He gestured to the viewing ports that showed the vast expanse of space beyond the station. Other tribes had warriors who fought like wild animals, fierce but unpredictable. Our warriors fought like hunters, calm and patient and deadly. We began to win battles against enemies who outnumbered us 10-1. The chamber was completely quiet now. Every delegate was caught up in the story of humanity's ancient past. Koreth taught us the sacred rules of war, Hugh said. Fight only when you must. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Show mercy to the defeated. Remember that your enemy today might be your ally tomorrow. An old hegemony senator spoke up. These are noble ideals, but war is rarely so clean. What happened when you faced enemies who showed no such mercy? Hayuk's expression grew darker. That is where the problems began. As we spread across our world, we met other groups of humans who had learned different lessons. Some had never met Koreth. Others had met different spirits, darker ones who taught only hatred and cruelty. He stopped pacing and stood very still. We found villages where children had been killed for sport. We discovered tribes that kept other humans as slaves, treating them worse than animals. We met warriors who tortured their prisoners and displayed their heads as trophies. The aliens in the chamber nodded. Every species had dealt with such brutal enemies at some point in their history. Our young warriors began to question Koreth's teachings, Hayuk said quietly. They asked why we should show mercy to beings who showed none. Why should we protect the weak when the strong could simply take what they needed? Why should we limit ourselves when our enemies had no such limits? Several alien delegates exchanged glances. They had heard similar questions in their own histories. Koreth always had the same answer, Hayuk continued. He would say that mercy was not weakness, but the hardest strength of all, that protecting others made us stronger, not weaker, that limits were what separated us from the beasts. The Zentari delegate leaned forward. But your warriors disagreed? Some did, Hayuk admitted. They saw our enemies growing bolder. They watched innocent people suffer while we followed rules that our enemies ignored. They began to whisper that perhaps Koreth was holding us back. Hayuk looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of as many delegates as he could. Do any of your species have stories like this? Times when your people questioned their gods? Most of the aliens looked uncomfortable. A few nodded reluctantly. The relationship between mortals and their deities was not always smooth. The whispers grew louder, Hayuk said, especially among the younger warriors who had never known the weakness we felt before Koreth came to us. They had been born into strength and victory. To them, our god's restraint seemed like cowardice. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with old sadness. They began to say that we no longer needed Koreth, that we had learned all he could teach us, that we were strong enough to stand on our own. The chamber remained silent, but the tension was growing. Every being present could sense where this story was heading, and none of them liked it. The breaking point came during the War of the Black Valley, Hayuk said. Our enemies had taken a settlement of peaceful farmers, men, women, children, all, slaughtered for no reason other than cruelty. When our warriors arrived, they found the bodies displayed like hunting trophies. Several aliens made sounds of disgust. Even the most warlike species usually had rules about protecting non-combatants. Our war leader that day was a man named Minho, Hyuk continued. He was young, strong, and had never lost a battle. When he saw what had been done to the innocent people, something broke inside him. Hayuk's voice grew quieter, forcing everyone to lean in to hear him. Minho called upon Koreth to appear. He demanded that our god give him permission to show these enemies the same mercy they had shown the farmers. None. The delegates held their breath, waiting to hear what happened next. But Koreth refused, Hayuk said simply. He appeared before all our warriors and said that becoming monsters would not bring back the dead. That revenge was not justice. That we must be better than our enemies, not worse. He looked around the chamber one more time. That was the moment everything changed, because for the first time in our history, a human warrior looked at our god and said, "No." The word "no" echoed through the Galactic Council chamber like a curse. Several alien delegates made religious signs with their hands, as if the very idea of refusing a god might bring bad luck. Hyuk continued his story, and his voice grew heavier with each word. After Minho defied Koreth that day, everything changed. Word spread quickly through all the human settlements. For the first time in our history, one of our own had looked our god in the eye and refused to obey. He began pacing again, his footsteps the only sound in the vast chamber. Some warriors were horrified. They believed Minho would be struck down for his disrespect. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. Koreth did not punish him. Our god simply disappeared. The Vorthak. Representative uncoiled slightly. The god abandoned your people? Not abandoned, Hayuk said carefully, but he withdrew his direct presence. No more visions, no more guidance. He left us to think about what Minho had done. Several aliens looked confused. Their own war gods were not known for such restraint. Most would have destroyed any mortal who dared to defy them. During this silence, more voices began to join Minho's, Hayuk continued. A warrior woman named Unha started asking difficult questions. She had fought in 12 major battles and never lost a single one. She began to wonder aloud why humans needed a god's permission to use their own strength. The chamber grew tense. The delegates could see where this was leading. Yunha gathered other successful warriors around her, Hayuk said, veterans who had won impossible victories, heroes who had saved countless lives. Together, they began to examine their own achievements. He stopped pacing and looked directly at the Zentari delegate. Tell me, when your people call upon Kraxus, does he fight your battles for you? The four-armed alien looked confused. Of course not. Kraxus provides blessing and guidance, but we must still do the fighting ourselves. Exactly, Hayuk said. And that is what Yunha and her followers realized. They looked at their victories and saw that every sword stroke, every tactical decision, every moment of courage had come from human hands and human hearts. Koreth had taught them, yes, but he had never fought for them. The implications hit several delegates at once. A Solani officer spoke up, his metallic voice ringing with concern. They began to believe they did not need their god. Worse than that, Hyuk replied. They began to believe that Koreth was holding them back. He resumed his pacing, and his movements became more agitated. A brilliant warrior philosopher named Do-hyun emerged as their leader. He was not like the others who simply wanted to kill their enemies. Do-hyun was a thinker, a planner. He made arguments that even the wisest elders found hard to answer. The old hegemony senator leaned forward. What kind of arguments? He pointed to all the innocents who had died while we followed Koreth's rules, Hyuk said. The settlements that were destroyed while we showed mercy to enemies who deserved none. The children who starved because we shared our food with prisoners who had killed their own families. Uncomfortable silence filled the chamber. Every species had faced similar moral dilemmas. Do-hyun was clever, Hyuk continued. He did not speak of abandoning honor or mercy completely. Instead, he argued that these concepts should come from human wisdom, not divine command. He said that we had grown beyond the need for a god to tell us right from wrong. Several delegates exchanged worried glances. This was dangerous thinking, the kind that led to dark places. The movement grew, Hayuk said. More warriors joined them every day, not just the cruel or the ambitious, but good people who were tired of watching evil triumph while they followed rules that their enemies ignored. He gestured to the viewing ports that showed the stars beyond the station. Among them was a young woman named Kyung. She had saved her entire village from raiders single-handedly, using tactics so brilliant that they were still being taught generations later. When such a hero questioned our god's wisdom, people listened. The Zentari delegate's 4 arms crossed over his chest. Surely not all humans agreed with this rebellion. No, Hayuk admitted. Many remained loyal to Koreth. They were led by a priestess named Jiwan, who had served our God faithfully for decades. She tried to remind people of how weak humanity had been before Koreth's arrival. She warned that abandoning our God would lead to endless cycles of violence and revenge. His voice grew sad. Jiwon was wise and kind, beloved by all who knew her. But wisdom and kindness seemed like weak weapons against the rage and frustration that was growing among the people. The chamber fell silent as the delegates absorbed this. They were hearing about the collapse of the relationship between an entire species and their divine patron. It was almost too horrible to contemplate. The arguments went on for years, HFY continued. In the end, they came down to a single question. Had Koreth made humanity strong, or had humanity been strong all along? He stopped pacing and stood very still. Do-hyun claimed that every human victory had been won by human hands, that every clever strategy had come from human minds, that every act of courage had flowed from human hearts. He asked what Koreth had actually contributed besides limitations and doubts. The Vorthak representative hissed softly. And what did the god say to these challenges? Nothing, HFY said simply. Koreth remained silent. Some believed this proved he had no good answers. Others thought he was giving humanity time to work through their doubts on their own. A young Solani officer called out from the observer. Action. But surely the god would not allow his own people to turn against him. Hayuk's expression grew very serious. That is what everyone assumed. Gods were powerful beyond mortal understanding. The idea that creatures like us could threaten beings who had shaped worlds and commanded storms seemed impossible. He looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as he could. But Do-hyun had been studying our god very carefully. He had noticed something that others had missed. The tension in the chamber became almost unbearable. Every delegate leaned forward, waiting to hear what terrible discovery had been made. Koreth loved us, Hyuk said quietly. Not as a master loves useful servants, but as a father loves his children. Every rule he had given us, every limitation he had placed on our actions, came from a desire to protect us from becoming the very monsters we fought against. Several aliens looked confused. Love seemed like a positive thing, not a weakness. Do-hyun realized that this love was Koreth's greatest vulnerability, Hyuk continued. Our God would never truly harm humanity, no matter how we treated him. He would argue with us, plead with us, try to guide us back to the right path, but he would never destroy us. The implications of this hit the chamber like a physical blow. Several delegates gasped or made sounds of horror in their native languages. Do-hyun gathered his followers on the holy mountain where Koreth first appeared to our people, Hyuk said. His voice became flat and emotionless, as if he were reciting a military report instead of telling a story. They brought with them prisoners, taken from the latest raid by our enemies, brutal killers who had tortured children for entertainment. They called upon Koreth to appear and demanded that he execute these monsters as they deserved. The chamber held its collective breath. When Koreth appeared and saw what they wanted, he refused once again. He said that mercy was not weakness, but the hardest strength of all. That becoming executioners would change us into something we would not recognize. Hyuk's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That was when Do-hyun spoke the words that doomed our God. Then you are no god of ours. The words hung in the air of the council chamber like a death sentence. Even the alien delegates, who had never met Koreth, felt the weight of that ancient declaration. Hyuk stood perfectly still as he continued his tale. The confrontation on the holy mountain was unlike anything that had ever happened before. Gods and mortals had disagreed many times throughout history, but never like this. He gestured with his hands as if he could still see the ancient scene playing out before him. Koreth appeared in all his glory, standing 20 feet tall with light radiating from his skin. His voice could shake mountains when he was angry, but that day he spoke softly, like a parent trying to reason with a stubborn child. The Zantari delegates' 4 eyes blinked in sequence. The gods still hope to change their minds? Yes, HFY said. Even then, Koreth believed that humanity would remember their better nature. He began to explain once again why mercy mattered, why restraint was not weakness, why becoming monsters would destroy us more completely than any enemy ever could. Several alien delegates nodded. They had heard similar wisdom from their own divine patrons over the centuries. But Do-hyun was ready for this, HFY continued. He had prepared his followers for exactly this moment. They had brought evidence. With them, proof of every atrocity that had been committed while humans followed Koreth's rules. HFY's voice became harder as he described the scene. They showed Koreth the bodies of children who had been killed while their parents showed mercy to captured enemies. They displayed the belongings of innocents who had died because human warriors had hesitated to strike first. They presented testimony from survivors who had begged for revenge that never came. The chamber grew uncomfortable. Every species had similar stories, times when mercy had led to greater suffering. For each piece of evidence, Do-hyun asked the same question, HFY said. How many must die for your conscience, my lord? How many innocents must suffer so that you can feel pure? The Vorthak representative coiled tighter around her floating seat. Harsh words to speak to a god, but effective ones, HFY admitted. Because Koreth had no good answer. Every rule he had given us, every limitation he had placed on our actions, had indeed led to deaths that could have been prevented. The god who preached protection of the innocent was forced to admit that his own teachings had failed to protect them. The old hegemony senator spoke up, his ancient voice full of concern. Surely the god could explain the greater purpose behind such sacrifices. HFY shook his head. Koreth tried. He spoke of the long view, of how unlimited violence would eventually consume humanity itself. He warned that becoming too much like our enemies would rob us of everything worth protecting. He painted pictures of a future where humans were feared and hated across the world, winning every battle but losing their souls. And the rebels? Asked a Silani observer. They laughed, HFY said simply. Nayeon, one of Do-hyun's most trusted lieutenants, stood up and pointed at the prisoners they had brought. Look at these creatures, my lord. They have no souls left to lose, yet they thrive. They take what they want and kill who they please. Why should we handicap ourselves with consciences they will never possess? The chamber fell silent. The question was brutal, but many of the delegates had asked similar things in their own hearts during particularly difficult wars. Koreth's response revealed the depth of his love for humanity. HFY continued. He did not grow angry at the challenge. Instead, he knelt down to be closer to his creations. He reached out his hands as if he wanted to embrace them all. Several aliens made sounds of sympathy. The image of a god humbling himself before mortals was both touching and tragic. My children, Koreth said, I know the path I have set for you is difficult. I know that mercy feels like weakness when you watch evil triumph. But I have seen what lies at the end of the other path. I have watched species consume themselves with their own violence until nothing remained but ash and regret. HFY paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the chamber. But Doyun was not moved. He stood up and walked closer to the kneeling god. "Then let us burn bright instead of fading slowly," he said. "Let us be strong instead of pure. Let us be feared instead of loved." The Zentari delegate leaned forward. The god must have been angry at such disrespect. "You would think so," Hayek said, but Korath only looked sadder. He stood up to his full height and spread his arms wide. "If that is truly what you want, then I will not stop you. But know this, the strength you seek comes with a price. You will become everything you once fought against." The chamber held its breath as Hayek described what happened next. Kyung, the brilliant young warrior who had saved her village, stepped forward. Her voice was strong and clear as she spoke. "We are willing to pay any price to protect what we love. If becoming monsters is what it takes to save our children, then we choose to be monsters." Several delegates made sounds of understanding. The desire to protect one's young was universal, and it could drive any species to terrible extremes. Other voices joined hers, Hyuk continued. Minho, who had first defied the god, declared that he would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. Yunha, the veteran of 12 battles, said that strength without limits was the only true strength. One by one, nearly every warrior present chose power over purity. The Vorthak representative uncoiled slightly. Nearly every warrior, Jiwan and a few others, remained loyal, Hayuk said sadly. The old priestess fell to her knees before Korath and begged him to forgive the others. She promised that some humans still understood the value of his teachings. His voice grew heavy with old grief. But even she was beginning to doubt. When she looked at the evidence Doyun had presented, when she saw the price that mercy had extracted from her people, she could not find the strength to argue against it. The chamber was completely silent now. Every being present could feel the tragedy building toward its inevitable conclusion. Korath looked around at his creations. For a long time, Hayek said, these were the people he had lifted from weakness to strength, the species he had guided from scattered tribes to a growing civilization, the children he had taught and protected and loved. He stopped speaking for several seconds, as if gathering courage for what came next. Finally, the god spoke one last time. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every human on the mountain. I understand your choice, my children, and because I love you, I will not force you to remain bound by rules you no longer believe in. Several alien delegates looked hopeful. Perhaps the god would simply release humanity from their obligations and leave them to find their own path. But Hyuk's expression grew darker. Do-hyun was not satisfied with mere freedom. He had studied our god too well, learned too much about divine nature. He knew that as long as Korath existed, there would always be humans who chose to follow the old ways. There would always be a voice of conscience calling them back from the dark path they wanted to walk. The implications hit the chamber like a thunderbolt. Several delegates gasped or made religious signs with their hands and appendages. So Do-yun made a demand that shocked even his own followers, Hyuk said quietly. If you truly love us, my lord, then prove it. Give us the strength to become what we need to become. Make us strong enough to protect what we love, no matter the cost. The Solani delegate's metallic voice rang with disbelief. He was asking the god to help them abandon his own teachings? Worse than that, Hayuk replied. He was asking Korath to give them the power to destroy everything the god stood for. And because Korath loved humanity more than he loved himself, Yuk's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast chamber. He said yes. The silence in the Galactic Council chamber was so complete that the hum of the space station's engines seemed loud. Every delegate stared at Hayuk with a mixture of horror and disbelief. He said yes, Hayuk repeated, his voice carrying the weight of ancient tragedy. Koreth, our god of war, agreed to help his own children destroy him. The Zentari delegate's four arms trembled slightly. Gods cannot be killed by mortals. It is impossible. That is what everyone believed, Hayuk said sadly. But Koreth was different from your war gods. His power came from love, not fear. His strength flowed from the bond between himself and humanity, and that bond could work both ways. He began to pace again, his movements slow and deliberate. What happened next was the most terrible battle in the history of our world, not because of the destruction it caused, though that was vast, but because it was the first war ever fought between a god and his own chosen people. The chamber remained deathly quiet as Hayuk continued his tale. Do-hyun had planned everything, carefully. He knew that fighting a god required more than weapons and courage. It required understanding exactly what kind of being Koreth was and how his divine nature worked. The Vorthak representative uncoiled from her seat slightly. What did they learn? That Koreth's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, Hyuk replied. Our god could command storms, shake mountains, and turn day into night. But all of his power was bound by his love for humanity. He could not bring himself to truly harm us, even to save himself. Several alien delegates made sounds of sympathy. The idea of a god trapped by his own compassion was both touching and terrible. The battle began at dawn, Hayuk said, his voice taking on the rhythm of an old war story. Thousands of human warriors surrounded the holy mountain where Koreth waited. They came with every weapon they could carry, every tactic they had learned, every trick of war that their god himself had taught them. He gestured as if he could see the ancient battlefield spread out before him. Leading them were Do-hyun the philosopher, Kyung the brilliant strategist, Nayeon the fearless fighter, and Minho the defiant one. Each of them was a master of war in their own right. The old hegemony senator leaned forward. And those who remained loyal to the god? Ji-won led them, Hayuk said, with obvious respect in his voice. The faithful priestess stood with perhaps 100 warriors who could not bring themselves to turn against their divine patron. They positioned themselves between the rebels and Koreth, knowing they would likely die. The chamber grew tense as delegates imagined the scene. A small group of loyalists facing thousands of their own people in defense of a god who might not even fight back. When the battle began, Koreth made one final attempt to reason with his children, Hyuk continued. He appeared in his full divine glory, so bright that looking at him was like staring at the sun. His voice shook the earth as he called out to them. Hayuk paused, as if remembering words that had been passed down through countless generations. My children, I know you are angry, I know you think my way is weakness, but please step back from this path. You do not understand what you are about to lose. Did any of them listen? Asked a Solani observer. A few hesitated, Hyuk admitted. Some of the younger warriors looked uncertain, but Do-hyun was ready for this moment. He had prepared words that would cut through any doubt. The ambassador's voice grew harder as he quoted the ancient rebel. Look around you, my lord. See the bodies of innocents who died because we followed your rules. Count the children who will never grow up because we showed mercy to those who deserved none. If this is the price of your love, then we reject it." The chamber shuddered at the coldness of those words. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had ever been fought, Hayuk said. On one side was a god of war with the power to level mountains. On the other were mortals armed with nothing but weapons and determination. But these were not ordinary mortals. They were the students of the being they fought against. He described the conflict in simple but vivid terms. Koreth could have ended the fight instantly. One gesture from him could have turned all the rebels to ash. But every time he raised his power to strike them down, he saw the faces of people he had taught to walk, had watched grow from children to adults, had blessed in their first battles. The Zentari delegate's voice was barely above a whisper. So he held back? He tried to find ways to stop them without killing them, Hayuk said. He created walls of light to block their advance. He summoned winds to blow their arrows off course. He shook the ground beneath their feet to knock them down without truly harming them. Several aliens nodded. This was the kind of restraint they could understand, a god trying to save his people from themselves. But the humans used that restraint against him, Hayuk continued, his voice growing cold. They had studied their god for generations. They knew his nature better than he knew it himself. Every moment he hesitated, they pressed their advantage. The chamber watched in horrified fascination as Hyuk described humanity's greatest crime. Kyung led a group of archers who had trained since childhood. Their arrows could not pierce divine flesh, but they could distract and blind. Naon commanded warriors who threw nets and ropes, not to capture a god, but to tangle his movements and limit his options. He continued the terrible catalog. Minho brought fire and smoke, not to burn an immortal being, but to cloud his vision and confuse his senses. And Do-hyun, the philosopher warrior, attacked with words as sharp as any blade. "Words?" asked the Vorthak representative. "The cruelest weapons of all," Hyuk replied. With every spell Koreth cast to protect his attackers from each other, Do-hyun pointed out how that energy could have been used to shield innocent villages. With every moment the god spent trying to reason with them, Do-hyun reminded him of the children who were dying while he wasted time on words. The psychological torture was almost worse than the physical battle. Several delegates looked sick as they imagined a god being tormented by his own compassion. The fight raged for 3 days and nights, Hayuk said. During that time, Ji-won and her loyal warriors were slowly overwhelmed. They fought bravely, but they were vastly outnumbered. One by one they fell, defending a god who would not fight back with his full power. His voice cracked slightly as he described the priestess's final moments. Ji-won died with her arms wrapped around Koreth's leg, still trying to shield him from his own people. Her last words were an apology for failing to protect him. The chamber fell silent in respect for the unknown priestess who had died so long ago. By the end of the 3rd day, Koreth was alone, Hayuk continued. Thousands of humans surrounded him, and he was wounded in ways that gods should not be able to suffer. Not physical wounds, but wounds of the spirit. Each act of betrayal, each moment of cruelty from his beloved children had torn pieces from his divine essence. The Solani delegate's metallic voice rang with confusion. "But gods are immortal. How could mortals actually kill such a being?" Hayuk's expression grew very serious. "That is when we learned the true nature of divine power. Gods are not separate from their worshippers. They are connected to them, fed by their faith, strengthened by their love. And if that connection can strengthen, He let the implication hang in the air until several delegates gasped in understanding. It can also destroy, the old hegemony senator finished quietly. Exactly, Hayuk said. Korath had poured so much of himself into humanity over the millennia that we had become part of his very essence. When we turned against him with focused hatred and deliberate cruelty, it was like a body's own blood becoming poison. The chamber watched in horror as Hayuk described the final moments. In the end, Korath did not die from weapons or wounds. He died from heartbreak. As the last of his divine light faded, he looked at his children one final time. And do you know what he said? Every being in the chamber leaned forward to hear the god's final words. He said, "I forgive you, and someday you will understand what you have lost." Hyuk stood very still for a long moment. Then Korath, god of war, protector of humanity, teacher of mercy and strength, dissolved into starlight and was gone forever. The silence that followed was profound. But then Hayuk spoke one more time, and his words chilled every delegate to their core. But we did not simply kill our god. In his final moment, as his divine essence scattered, something unexpected happened. Instead of disappearing completely, Korath's power flowed into every human who had participated in his destruction. The implications hit the chamber like a physical blow. We had not destroyed our god of war, Hyuk said quietly. We had become him. The Galactic Council chamber remained frozen in horrified silence as Hyuk's words sank in. The idea that an entire species had absorbed their own god was beyond anything the alien delegates could comprehend. Hyuk continued his tale, his voice now carrying a different weight. In the moments after Korath's death, the humans on the Holy Mountain felt the change immediately. Do-hyun, who had led the rebellion, suddenly found his mind filled with knowledge he had never learned. Battle strategies from 1,000 conflicts, tactical wisdom gathered across centuries, the ability to read an enemy's intentions before they even formed in their minds. The Zentari delegate's forearms crossed over his chest protectively. The god's knowledge became theirs? More than knowledge, Hayuk replied. His very essence, his divine understanding of war itself, but without the compassion and restraint that had defined Korath's character. They had rejected those parts of him, after all. Several alien observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The implications were becoming clear, and none of them liked what they were hearing. Kyung discovered that she could predict enemy movements with supernatural accuracy, Hayuk continued. Nayeon found that weapons felt like extensions of her own body, that she could fight with any tool as if she had trained with it for decades. Minho realized that he understood the psychology of fear and courage in ways that let him break enemy morale with a single well-timed charge. The Vorthak representative uncoiled nervously. And this power spread to all humans? To every person who had been present at the deicide? Yes, Hayuk confirmed. Thousands of warriors suddenly found themselves carrying fragments of divine war wisdom. But it did not stop there. He began pacing again, his movements more energetic now. Over the following generations, as these God-touched humans had children, they passed on pieces of that inherited power. Not as strong as what the original participants possessed, but still far beyond what any mortal should have been able to access. The old hegemony senator leaned forward with concern. The entire species was transforming? Slowly, yes, Hayuk said. Each generation carried more of Korath's essence. What had once required divine blessing now came naturally to human children. They understood tactics before they could read. They grasped the principles of warfare as easily as they learned to walk. He gestured toward the viewing ports that showed the vast expanse of space beyond the station. By the time we developed the technology to leave our world and explore the stars, we had become something unprecedented in the galaxy. A species where every individual carried the instincts and knowledge of a war god. The chamber buzzed with worried conversations in dozens of alien languages. The delegates were beginning to understand why humanity had such a fearsome military reputation. The first sign that something fundamental had changed came during our early expansion, Hayek continued. A human explorer named Seojin led our initial contact with an aggressive alien species called the Corvan Horde. They were raiders who had terrorized that region of space for centuries. The Solani delegate's metallic voice rang with curiosity. What happened when they met humanity? Seojin took one look at the Corvan fleet formations and immediately understood 17 different ways to destroy them, Hyuk said simply. He had never fought in space before, had never even seen alien technology, but the tactical knowledge was there in his mind as if he had been born with it. Several delegates made sounds of disbelief. The idea of intuitive military genius on such a scale was almost impossible to accept. The battle lasted 6 hours, Hayek continued. The Corvans had been raiders for over 1,000 years, had conquered dozens of worlds, had never met an enemy they could not eventually defeat. Seojin wiped out their entire fleet with a force 1/10 their size. He paused to let that sink in before continuing. But that was not the most disturbing part. After the battle, when Corvan survivors were interviewed, they all said the same thing. They had not been defeated by superior technology or greater numbers. They had been defeated by an enemy who seemed to know their every move before they made it. The chamber grew quieter as the implications became clear. More human explorers followed Seojin into space, Hayek said. Each one encountered different alien species, different technologies, different forms of warfare, and each one adapted instantly, as if they carried the accumulated wisdom of every conflict that had ever been fought. A young Vorthak observer called out from the gallery. Surely this was just exceptional talent among your explorers? Hyuk shook his head. That is what we thought at first. But then we began to test ordinary humans, people with no military training or combat experience. A farmer named Bora was given a simulation of naval warfare between 2 alien fleets. She had never seen spaceships before, could barely read the tactical displays, but within minutes, she was commanding the simulation forces with the skill of a veteran admiral. The delegates exchanged worried glances. This was beyond natural talent or good training. We tested children, Hayek continued. Teenagers who had never held weapons were given war games to play. They solved tactical problems that had puzzled alien military academies for decades. They developed strategies that professional generals had never considered. The Zentari delegates' voice was barely above a whisper. Your entire species had become... What exactly? We did not understand it ourselves at first, Hyuk admitted. We knew we were unusually good at warfare, but we thought it was just human nature. It was not until we began studying other species' military capabilities that we realized how different we had become. He gestured toward several of the alien delegates. Your people train for years to become competent warriors. You study at academies, learn from masters, practice until expertise becomes second nature. But for humans, that expertise is simply there from birth. The chamber fell silent as the delegates absorbed this information. A human child playing with toy soldiers will arrange them in formations that maximize tactical advantage, Hayek said. They do not learn this from books or teachers. The knowledge is part of them, written into their very nature. The old hegemony senator spoke up, his ancient voice heavy with concern. And this affects all humans? Not just those with military aptitude? Every single one, Hayek confirmed. A human artist who has never held a weapon can look at a battle plan and immediately spot its weaknesses. A human doctor who dedicates their life to healing can still analyze enemy formations and devise counter-strategies without conscious effort. Several delegates made sounds of distress. The idea of an entire species with innate military genius was terrifying. We began to realize the true scope of our inheritance when we encountered our first major interstellar war, Hyuk continued. The conflict between the Zilani Federation and the outer colonies had been raging for decades. Millions had died, entire star systems had been devastated, and neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The chamber listened intently as he described humanity's first involvement in galactic warfare. The Federation asked for human assistance. Hayek said, "We sent a single advisor, a woman named Wu Jin who had been a school teacher before volunteering, for military service. She had no formal combat training, no experience with large-scale operations, no knowledge of alien warfare tactics." He paused dramatically. The war ended in 3 weeks. The silence that followed was profound. Wu Jin took one look at the strategic situation and saw patterns that had been invisible to both sides for decades, Hyuk explained. She identified supply line vulnerabilities that professional military analysts had missed. She predicted enemy movements with accuracy that seemed supernatural. She developed battle plans that were simultaneously so simple and so brilliant that experienced generals wondered why they had never thought of them. The Vorthak representative coiled tighter around her seat. One person ended a decades-long war? Not through superior firepower or advanced technology, Hayek said. Through pure tactical brilliance. The kind of understanding that should have taken lifetimes to develop, but which came to her as naturally as breathing. The chamber erupted in worried conversations as delegates discussed the implications in their native languages. Yuk raised his hand for silence. That was when we finally understood what we had inherited from Koreth. We had not simply gained his knowledge or his power, we had become living embodiments of the concept of warfare itself. He looked around the chamber, meeting as many alien eyes as he could. Every human carries within them the instinctive understanding of conflict that once belonged to a god. But unlike Koreth, we feel no divine obligation to show mercy or restraint. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for many of the delegates, and the horror on their faces was unmistakable. You are a species of war gods, the old hegemony, Senator said quietly. But without the wisdom or compassion that should guide such power. Hyuk nodded grimly. Now you begin to understand why we are alone in not having a patron deity of war. We do not need one. His voice grew cold as he delivered. The final revelation of this part of his story. We became one. The Galactic Council chamber remained tense as Hyuk continued his tale. The alien delegates now understood they were not simply hearing the history of another species, but learning the origin of the galaxy's most feared military force. As humanity spread across the stars, our reputation grew with us, Hyuk said. What had started as stories of unusual tactical brilliance became legends of impossible victories. And those legends attracted attention from beings who should have known better than to test us. He gestured toward a section of the chamber where military observers sat. The first real test of our inherited abilities came when we encountered the Crimson Armada. Perhaps some of you remember them? Several older delegates nodded grimly. The Crimson Armada had been a notorious collection of pirate fleets that had terrorized 3 sectors for over a century. The Armada had never lost a major engagement, Hayek continued. Their admiral, a being called Scathach the Blood Drinker, commanded over 10,000 ships and had defeated the combined fleets of 17 different worlds. When they turned their attention to human colonies, everyone expected a massacre. See, Zentari delegates' 4 eyes focused intently on Hayek. But that is not what happened? No, Hayek said simply. We sent Admiral Tai Yang to deal with the threat. He was young for such a command, barely 30 years old, with a fleet of only 800 ships. The military experts of a dozen species predicted he would be destroyed within hours of engaging the enemy. The chamber was completely silent now, waiting to hear about this ancient battle. The engagement lasted exactly 47 minutes, Hyuk said. When it was over, the entire Crimson Armada had been eliminated. Not defeated, not scattered, but completely destroyed. 10,000 enemy ships reduced to debris, and we lost fewer than 30 vessels. Gasps and sounds of disbelief filled the chamber. Even in a galaxy used to unlikely victories, such numbers were impossible to accept. How? Asked the Vorthak representative, her voice barely above a whisper. Tai Yang had studied the armadas, previous battles, and identified patterns in their tactics that even they did not know they had, Hyuk explained. He predicted not just their general strategy, but their specific movements down to the minute. When the pirates arrived at what they thought would be an ambush, they found themselves flying directly into perfectly placed kill zones. He paused, allowing the delegates to visualize the ancient battle. But the tactical brilliance was only part of it. During the fight, Tai Yang made adjustments and counterattacks that no one had taught him, responses that came from some deeper understanding of warfare that defied explanation. The old hegemony senator leaned forward. You speak as if he was guided by instinct rather than training. Exactly, Hyuk confirmed. That is how it works for all of us. Human commanders do not just learn tactics, they feel them. They understand the flow of battle the way others understand breathing. It is not knowledge that can be taught or forgotten. It simply is. Several alien military observers in the gallery began taking notes, their faces grim with concern. Word of the Crimson Armada's destruction spread quickly, Hyuk continued. Other aggressive species began to take notice of humanity. Some thought our victory was luck or superior technology. They decided to test us themselves. The Solani delegates' metallic voice carried a note of dread. And were they successful? The hegemony expansion war lasted 3 years and involved over 40 different species, Hayek said. It was the largest conflict the galaxy had seen in centuries. Against us were arrayed some of the finest military minds and most advanced weapons in known space. He began pacing again, his movements reflecting the energy of the story he was telling. Leading our forces was General Minji, who had been a civilian engineer before the war began. She had no formal military education, had never commanded anything larger than a construction crew. But when the fighting started, something awakened in her. The chamber listened intently as Hyuk described humanity's largest military engagement. Minji looked at the strategic situation and immediately understood things that had taken enemy generals decades to learn, he said. She saw how different alien psychology affected their battle tactics. She recognized how various technologies could be turned against their creators. She developed strategies that used each enemy species' strengths as weaknesses. The Zentari delegate's voice carried reluctant respect. She sounds like a formidable opponent. She was terrifying, Hyuk said bluntly. Allied commanders would send her reports of enemy movements, expecting to receive detailed orders in response. Instead, Minji would glance at the information and immediately know exactly what needed to be done. She could coordinate battles across multiple star systems as easily as others might organize a dinner party. He gestured toward different sections of the chamber as he described the scope of the conflict. Against the Zelani, she used their honor-bound combat traditions to predict their moves. Against the Korthak, she exploited their hive-mind communication delays. Against the Solani, she turned their own analytical nature into paralysis by giving them too many variables to process. Several delegates looked uncomfortable as they recognized their own species' tactical weaknesses being described. But the most unsettling thing was not her strategic brilliance, Hyuk continued. It was how natural it all seemed to her. Other commanders studied for years to understand even basic principles of large-scale warfare. For Minji, commanding millions of troops across hundreds of battles felt as normal as walking. The Vorthak representative uncoiled slightly. And the outcome of this war? Total victory, Hyuk said simply. The 40-species alliance surrendered after losing 70% of their combined military strength. The remaining forces were so demoralized that many simply disbanded rather than continue fighting. The chamber erupted in worried conversations as delegates discussed the implications in hushed tones. During the post-war analysis, military scholars from across the galaxy studied our tactics, Hyuk continued. They wanted to understand how we had achieved such overwhelming success. What they found disturbed them more than our victories had. The old hegemony senator looked up from his notes. What did they discover? That we had not simply outfought our enemies, Hyuk said. We had outthought them in ways that should have been impossible. Human commanders had consistently predicted enemy actions with accuracy rates that exceeded statistical probability. We had developed counter-strategies for weapons and tactics we had never seen before. We had adapted to alien forms of warfare faster than the aliens who had created them. He stopped pacing and looked directly at the assembled delegates. The scholars concluded that fighting humans was like fighting an enemy who could read minds, not because we had supernatural powers, but because our understanding of warfare was so complete that we could predict behavior patterns that even our enemies did not know they had. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. One alien military historian named Kieran spent years studying our combat methods, Hyuk said. She interviewed captured human officers, analyzed our battle tactics, studied recordings of our communications during fights. Her final report became classified at the highest levels of galactic security. Several delegates leaned forward with obvious curiosity about what had been discovered. Kieran concluded that humans did not fight like other species. Hyuk continued. Most beings approach warfare as a learned skill, something that requires training and experience to master. But humans approach it as an art form that we were born understanding. He gestured toward the military observers in the gallery. Your warriors become skilled through practice and study. Our warriors are skilled from the moment they first pick up a weapon. Your commanders learn to read battlefields through years of education. Our commanders understand battlefields instinctively, as if the knowledge was written into their souls. The Solani delegate's voice carried a note of fear. And this applies to all humans? Every single one, Hyuk confirmed. A human civilian with no military training can look at a tactical situation and immediately grasp complexities that would take your professional officers hours to analyze. They might not have the vocabulary to explain what they see, but they understand it at a fundamental level. The chamber buzzed with nervous energy as delegates began to fully comprehend what they were hearing. There was one incident during the border conflicts that perfectly illustrated this difference, HFY said. A human merchant ship was attacked by raiders while carrying a group of civilian passengers. Among them was an elderly man named Sun Wu, who had been a farmer his entire life. He paused to let the setup sink in before continuing. When the ship's captain was killed in the initial attack, Sun Wu took command of the defense. He had never been in combat, had never seen military equipment before, had no training in space warfare. But within minutes, he was coordinating the ship's defenses like a veteran commander. The Zentari delegate's voice carried disbelief. A farmer became a military commander? More than that, HFY said. Sun Wu analyzed the attacking fleet's formation and identified weaknesses that the raiders themselves did not know existed. He used the merchant ship's cargo handling systems as improvised weapons. He coordinated with nearby vessels to create The Galactic Council chamber remained tense as HFY continued his tale. The alien delegates now understood they were not simply hearing the history of another species, but learning the origin of the galaxy's most feared military force. As humanity spread across the stars, our reputation grew with us, HFY said. What had started as stories of unusual tactical brilliance became legends of impossible victories. And those legends attracted attention from beings who should have known better than to test us. He gestured toward a section of the chamber where military observers sat. The first real test of our inherited abilities came when we encountered the Crimson Armada. Perhaps some of you remember them? Several older delegates nodded grimly. The Crimson Armada had been a notorious collection of pirate fleets that had terrorized 3 sectors for over a century. The Armada had never lost a major engagement, HFY continued. Their admiral, a being called Scathach the Blood Drinker, commanded over 10,000 ships and had defeated the combined fleets of 17 different worlds. When they turned their attention to human colonies, everyone expected a massacre. The Zentari delegates' 4 eyes focused intently on HFY. But that is not what happened? No, HFY said simply. We sent Admiral Tai Yang to deal with the threat. He was young for such a command, barely 30 years old with a fleet of only 800 ships. The military experts of a dozen species predicted he would be destroyed within hours of engaging the enemy. The chamber was completely silent now, waiting to hear about this ancient battle. The engagement lasted exactly 47 minutes, HFY said. When it was over, the entire Crimson Armada had been eliminated. Not defeated, not scattered, but completely destroyed. 10,000 enemy ships reduced to debris, and we lost fewer than 30 vessels. Gasps and sounds of disbelief filled the chamber. Even in a galaxy used to unlikely victories, such numbers were impossible to accept. How? Asked the Vorthak representative, her voice barely above a whisper. Tai Yang had studied the armadas, previous battles, and identified patterns in their tactics that even they did not know they had, HFY explained. He predicted not just their general strategy, but their specific movements down to the minute. When the pirates arrived at what they thought would be an ambush, they found themselves flying directly into perfectly placed kill zones. He paused, allowing the delegates to visualize the ancient battle. But the tactical brilliance was only part of it. During the fight, Taeyang made adjustments and counterattacks that no one had taught him, responses that came from some deeper understanding of warfare that defied explanation. The old hegemony senator leaned forward. "You speak as if he was guided by instinct rather than training." "Exactly," Hyuk confirmed. "That is how it works for all of us. Human commanders do not just learn tactics, they feel them. They understand the flow of battle the way others understand breathing. It is not knowledge that can be taught or forgotten. It simply is." Several alien military observers in the gallery began taking notes, their faces grim with concern. "Word of the Crimson Armada's destruction spread quickly," Hyuk continued. "Other aggressive species began to take notice of humanity. Some thought our victory was luck or superior technology. They decided to test us themselves. The Silani delegates'" metallic voice carried a note of dread. "And were they successful?" "The Hegemony Expansion War lasted 3 years and involved over 40 different species," Hyuk said. "It was the largest conflict the galaxy had seen in centuries. Against us were arrayed some of the finest military minds and most advanced weapons in known space." He began pacing again, his movements reflecting the energy of the story he was telling. "Leading our forces was General Minji, who had been a civilian engineer before the war began. She had no formal military education, had never commanded anything larger than a construction crew. But when the fighting started, something awakened in her." The chamber listened intently as Hyuk described humanity's largest military engagement. Minji looked at the strategic situation and immediately understood things that had taken enemy generals decades to learn, he said. She saw how different alien psychology affected their battle tactics. She recognized how various technologies could be turned against their creators. She developed strategies that used each enemy species' strengths as weaknesses. The Zentari delegate's voice carried reluctant respect. "She sounds like a formidable opponent." "She was terrifying," Hyuk said bluntly. Allied commanders would send her reports of enemy movements, expecting to receive detailed orders in response. Instead, Minji would glance at the information and immediately know exactly what needed to be done. She could coordinate battles across multiple star systems as easily as others might organize a dinner party. He gestured toward different sections of the chamber as he described the scope of the conflict. Against the Zilani, she used their honor-bound combat traditions to predict their moves. Against the Korthak, she exploited their hive mind communication delays. Against the Silani, she turned their own analytical nature into paralysis by giving them too many variables to process. Several delegates looked uncomfortable as they recognized their own species' tactical weaknesses being described. But the most unsettling thing was not her strategic brilliance, Hyuk continued. It was how natural it all seemed to her. Other commanders studied for years to understand even basic principles of large-scale warfare. For Minji, commanding millions of troops across hundreds of battles felt as normal as walking. The Vorthak representative uncoiled slightly. "And the outcome of this war? Total victory," Hyuk said simply. The 40-species alliance surrendered after losing 70% of their combined military strength. The remaining forces were so demoralized that many simply disbanded rather than continue fighting. The chamber erupted in worried conversations as delegates discussed the implications in hushed tones. During the post-war analysis, military scholars from across the galaxy studied our tactics, Hyuk continued. They wanted to understand how we had achieved such overwhelming success. What they found disturbed them more than our victories had. The old hegemony senator looked up from his notes. What did they discover? That we had not simply outfought our enemies, Hayuk said. We had outthought them in ways that should have been impossible. Human commanders had consistently predicted enemy actions with accuracy rates that exceeded statistical probability. We had developed counter-strategies for weapons and tactics we had never seen before. We had adapted to alien forms of warfare faster than the aliens who had created them. He stopped pacing and looked directly at the assembled delegates. The scholars concluded that fighting humans was like fighting an enemy who could read minds, not because we had supernatural powers, but because our understanding of warfare was so complete that we could predict behavior patterns that even our enemies did not know they had. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. One alien military historian named Kieran spent years studying our combat methods, Hayuk said. She interviewed captured human officers, analyzed our battle tactics, studied recordings of our communications during fights. Her final report became classified at the highest levels of galactic security. Several delegates leaned forward with obvious curiosity about what had been discovered. Kieran concluded that humans did not fight like other species, Hayuk continued. Most beings approach warfare as a learned skill, something that requires training and experience to master. But humans approach it as an art form that we were born understanding. He gestured toward the military observers in the gallery. Your warriors become skilled through practice and study. Our warriors are skilled from the moment they first pick up a weapon. Your commanders learn to read battlefields through years of education. Our commanders understand battlefields instinctively, as if the knowledge was written into their souls. The Solani delegate's voice carried a note of fear. And this applies to all humans? Every single one, Hayuk confirmed. A human civilian with no military training can look at a tactical situation and immediately grasp complexities that would take your professional officers hours to analyze. They might not have the vocabulary to explain what they see, but they understand it at a fundamental level. The chamber buzzed with nervous energy as delegates began to fully comprehend what they were hearing. There was one incident during the border conflicts that perfectly illustrated this difference, Hayuk said. A human merchant ship was attacked by raiders while carrying a group of civilian passengers. Among them was an elderly man named Sun Wu, who had been a farmer his entire life. He paused to let the setup sink in before continuing. When the ship's captain was killed in the initial attack, Sun Wu took command of the defense. He had never been in combat, had never seen military equipment before, had no training in space warfare, but within minutes, he was coordinating the ship's defenses like a veteran commander. The Zentari delegate's voice carried disbelief. A farmer became a military commander? More than that, Hayuk said. Sun Wu analyzed the attacking fleet's formation and identified weaknesses that the raiders themselves did not know existed. He used the merchant ship's cargo handling systems as improvised weapons. He coordinated with nearby vessels to create a